Welcome to our deep dive today. We are going to be tackling English grammar today, but not in like the typical boring way. We're going to explore, those little sneaky mistakes that we all make sometimes and see if we can kind of crack the code to better English with some help from the English Unlocked podcast.
Yeah, I think it's really about moving beyond, just memorizing rules. And I think the podcast does a great job of explaining why these common errors kind of pop up in the first place. You know what I mean?
Right. Like sometimes it feels like our brains are stuck in this loop, especially when we're thinking in our native language and trying to translate directly into English.
Exactly. The podcast calls out 5 common errors that often stem from this kind of thinking. We've got subject-verb agreement, we've got prepositions, tenses gone wild, run-on sentences, and those articles. Always a good time. Which one kind of jumps out at you as particularly tricky?
Oh, gosh. Prepositions have always been a bit of a mystery to me. It's like, why good at English and not good in English? The logic can be so slippery sometimes.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating how prepositions can be so idiomatic and vary so much between languages. Even for someone who studied English for a while, they can still trip you up. The podcast suggests, paying close attention to preposition usage in different contexts, really seeing them in action.
So it's not just about learning a rule, but really understanding how prepositions function in real-life situations.
Right, precisely.
Okay.
The English Unlocked podcast dives into subject-verb agreement, and they highlight how sentence structure differences between languages can lead to confusion. In some languages, the verb form doesn't change based on the subject, and that can create some, hiccups in English.
That makes a lot of sense. I've noticed that those errors seem to be more common among speakers whose, native languages have a different sentence structure than English.
Right. It's a great example of how understanding the underlying linguistic reasons behind an error can be so much more helpful than simply memorizing a rule. Instead of thinking, oh, I need to remember to add an "es" to the verb, you can start to analyze the sentence structure itself and see if the subject and verb truly agree.
That's a really helpful way to approach it. It feels less like rote memorization and more like, detective work.
Yeah.
What are some of the other common errors they highlight, and how do they suggest we tackle them?
Well, tenses are another big one. The podcast talks about how English has so many different tenses, each with its own specific meaning. And it can be, a bit overwhelming to keep them all straight in your mind.
Oh, tell me about it. I still find myself double-checking the past perfect tense sometimes, like, had I done it or did I do it? It can get so confusing.
It's great that you bring up that specific example because the podcast suggests keeping a grammar mistake notebook where you can jot down those tricky situations and the correct usage so that way you create a personalized reference guide based on your own learning journey.
That's a great tip. I'm definitely going to start doing that. What about those dreaded run-on sentences? Those can be tough to spot, especially when you're in the flow of writing.
They really can. The podcast emphasizes the importance of clear punctuation. They advise taking a moment to, breathe and consider whether a period or a comma is needed to create a more natural pause and improve the clarity for the reader.
It's like giving your reader a break, right? No one wants to wade through a sentence that just keeps going and going. And then we have those tiny but mighty articles. A, and the one. Sometimes it feels like they have a mind of their own.
They certainly can be tricky, especially for learners whose native languages don't have articles or use them differently. The podcast encourages us to pay attention to how native speakers use articles and to try to internalize those patterns through exposure to authentic English.
So it's about training our ears and eyes to pick up on those subtle nuances, rather than just trying to memorize a bunch of rules. It sounds like English Unlocked is really advocating for a more intuitive approach to grammar.
Absolutely. They're all about understanding the why behind the rules and developing a deeper sense of how the language actually works.
Okay. So we've identified some of the common culprits that trip us up. But how do we actually start making progress and improving our grammar? English Unlocked suggests 5 strategies, right?
That's right. They offer 5 key strategies: reading, listening, practicing, using tools, and learning from mistakes. And what strikes me as particularly interesting is their emphasis on, finding what works best for you. Not everything's going to be a good fit for every learner, right?
I love that they acknowledge that everyone learns differently. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So for those of us who love, curling up with a good book, They suggest choosing reading material that genuinely interests you.
Right, exactly. Whether it's a mystery novel or a science fiction epic or even just your favorite blog, the key is to find something that keeps you engaged. And they highlight how enjoyment plays a crucial role in absorbing grammar naturally. It shouldn't feel like a chore.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. When you're hooked on a story, you're not even thinking about the grammar. You're just immersed in the language.
And that kind of immersion is incredibly powerful. It allows you to internalize the patterns and rhythms of English without even realizing it.
So reading for pleasure is like a secret weapon for grammar improvement. What about listening? They mentioned that podcasts and TV shows and movies can be helpful too.
They do. They really stress the importance of diversifying your listening sources. So don't just stick to one accent or style. Explore different genres, different speakers, different regions. It helps you develop a more well-rounded understanding of how English is used in various contexts.
So it's about expanding your ear for the language, getting used to the nuances of pronunciation and intonation, and even slang.
Precisely. And the beauty of listening is that it can be a passive activity. You know you can do it while you're commuting, exercising, or even doing chores.
It's like sneaking in some grammar practice without even trying. I'm all about that kind of efficiency. They also talk about the importance of active practice, though,
Right.
like actually using the language.
Absolutely. They encourage us to find opportunities to use English in real life situations as much as possible. So it could be joining an online language exchange, having conversations with native speakers, writing in a journal, or even just narrating your day in English as you go about your routine.
It's about taking those grammar rules out of the textbook
Yeah.
and putting them into action, turning knowledge into a skill, so to speak.
Yeah.
What about grammar tools? I know there's so many apps and websites out there these days.
Yeah. And English Unlocked advises us to choose tools that align with our individual needs and comfort levels. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer number of options, so they suggest experimenting and finding what works best for you.
It's like finding the right workout routine. You need to find something that you enjoy and that fits your learning style. Some people might prefer a structured app, while others might benefit more from a grammar checker integrated into their writing software. It's about finding the right fit for you.
Exactly. And when it comes to learning from our mistakes, the podcast reiterates the power of that grammar mistake notebook that we talked about earlier.
Right, but they don't just suggest writing down the error, do they? They encourage like a more analytical approach.
That's right. They recommend taking the time to analyze why you made that mistake. Was it a simple slip up? Or does it point to a deeper misunderstanding of a grammar rule? By identifying the root cause, you can target your learning more effectively.
Yeah. It turns those mistakes into valuable learning opportunities. So English Unlocked is really advocating for a holistic approach to grammar improvement, combining both passive and active learning strategies.
And throughout all of this, they emphasize the importance of personalization and finding what works best for your unique learning style. It's empowering because it puts you in control of your language learning journey.
That's such a crucial point. It's about moving beyond feeling intimidated by grammar rules and instead becoming a more confident and empowered learner. And this leads us to what I think is the most intriguing idea from the podcast: thinking in English.
It really is a fascinating concept. It's about shifting from constantly translating in your head to actually thinking and processing information directly in English.
It sounds almost like a mental switch flips and you're suddenly operating on a different wavelengths.
Yeah.
But how do you even begin to make that shift?
Well, the English Unlocked podcast is going to delve deeper into that in their next episode, but we can start to think about it now. What comes to mind for you when you hear thinking in English?
I guess it makes me think about how sometimes I catch myself narrating my actions in English, even when I'm alone. Like, okay, now I'm going to make coffee. It feels like a small step toward thinking in the language.
That's a great example. It shows that you're already starting to internalize the language and use it automatically without even really conscious effort. The podcast suggests incorporating more of those little moments into your day, just little things here and there.
So instead of just thinking I'm hungry, I could think I'm feeling peckish. I wonder what I should have for lunch.
Exactly. It's about actively engaging with the language in your mind, even for those everyday thoughts and actions. It doesn't have to be anything complicated.
It's almost like giving your brain a workout in English.
Yeah.
And the more you do it, the stronger those mental muscles become.
That's a great analogy. It highlights how thinking in English is a skill that you can develop over time with consistent practice. And as the podcast emphasizes, the rewards can be huge. Really significant.
Yeah, they talk about it being a game changer for fluency, right?
Right. They suggest that when you can think in English, you unlock a whole new level of spontaneity and natural expression. You're not hindered by that constant translation process in your head. It's like you can just be yourself in the language.
It's like you're free from those mental chains and the language can flow more effortlessly.
Exactly. And that can boost your confidence in speaking and writing, too. When you're not struggling to translate, you can focus more on conveying your message effectively.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today, it seems like the key takeaway is that mastering English grammar is about more than just memorizing rules. It's about developing a deeper understanding of how the language works.
Yeah. It's about understanding why those rules exist, finding strategies that work for you, and ultimately striving to internalize the language to the point where you can think in English.
And while that might sound like a really lofty goal, it's something we can all work towards, step by step.
Mm.
You know, it's a journey of continuous improvement, and every little effort counts.
I think that's a great note to end on. It's about embracing the process, enjoying the challenge, and celebrating every milestone along the way.